We're delighted that you've joined us this evening for what I know is going to be a robust and informative and I think an enjoyable conversation. I'm Dan SWEENEY, the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics here at the Daniels College of Business on the University of Denver campus. Before we get started, there he is. Before we get started, I'd like to invite the Dean of the Daniels College of Business to come up and welcome you as well. Dean Crate.
Thanks very much. Good evening. As Dan said, I'm Brent Crate. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the Daniels College. Let me welcome you to the Ryman Theater at Marjorie Reed Hall at the Daniels College of Business. We are absolutely thrilled to have you. This is, of course, the eve of the college's annual Executive Summit, and it's hard to imagine a more auspicious occasion on which to begin our activities than coming here. So this is the 4th annual Elevate Ethics Symposium. In many ways, it represents the best of what we do as a business school. It sets a critically important standard for how we reciprocally and meaningfully, and we hope in a way that is mutually beneficially, engage with critical stakeholders. There are lots of reasons that this has been such a huge success. Obviously, our sponsors, starting with CoBank and IHS Markit and Deloitte and the Daniels Fund and others. But it has been primarily because of the tenacity and energy and leadership of Dan SWEENEY. And what this represents is an affirmation, if you will, of our commitment to not only teach and expose and elevate principles of ethics, but to ensure that we prepare our students for a world that requires them to migrate with sort of deftness and skill, an increasingly volatile environment. For us, these principles and concepts are not merely academic, they are really part of the institution's DNA, as is defined by our namesake and benefactor, the way we structure our curriculum and the way we go about our business. We have an extraordinary panel. We are so grateful for you all taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedules to be with us this evening. Could not be happier that it is moderated by one of our own iconic professors, if I may. And so I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Dan for stewarding this incredibly important resource. It is only going to become more elevated in the context of the college and the university. And so I hope you enjoy the evening's activities. And again, thank you.
Thank you, Brent. It's always tough to follow Brent because he has his notes but never looks at them. I have to read everything. So, but I'm older than he is, so that's my excuse. Well, the Institute, as well as events like this, could never occur if it weren't for the generosity of our sponsors and the support and cooperation of our partners. You've been seeing their logos on the loop for maybe a little longer than you had anticipated, and I'd like to recognize them individually now. Our charter partners are first CoBank, and CoBank was our inaugural charter sponsor and helped us get this institute off the ground about 5 years ago. Followed very quickly by Level 3 Communications, who is helping the institute establish a high-speed global electronic footprint through their global IP platform. And so we're actually streaming this tonight to wherever the audience may be around the globe. Our hosting sponsors for Elevate Ethics 2017 are IHS Markit and the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. Program sponsors to help the Institute's various events include Deloitte LLC, Newmont Mining, and a number of individual members and friends of the Institute. Important partners of the Institute include the National Association of Corporate Directors, the University of Denver chapter of Net Impact, a global association of MBA students, and Rock Solid Design, who's responsible for all these great graphics and the videos and all the technical stuff that goes on here. So thank you to all these sponsors and partners of the Institute. I would like to also acknowledge the support of our colleagues at the University of Denver senior leadership team who have joined us this evening, and I'd like to especially thank Doug Scribner, who's, there he is, Doug. Come on, stand up and say hello. So people. Doug has become a good friend of the Institute, and we really appreciate his personal representation in these events. So now, why are we here? What are we attempting to do this evening? You know, we're all aware, I think, of the reportage, the editorial opinions, the commentary on the blogosphere, regularly criticizing the current state of corporate integrity and responsibility among today's corporate leaders. I saw another example of that in this morning's paper when all the writers seemed to be surprised that all 15 of the Wells Fargo directors were not just summarily thrown off the board. Public opinion polls consistently report the low esteem of our business institutions and their leaders, but the public very seldom hears much from the business community itself, and especially from senior operating officers of those businesses. So far, it's been kind of a one-way conversation. So it is our goal at Elevate Ethics to provide a forum and a voice for that discussion. We intend this dialogue to achieve three goals. First, to provide a platform for corporate leaders to comment on their view of corporate integrity and corporate responsibility and corporate governance in the world of American business today. Secondly, to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas on the effective development of ethical leadership in American business organizations. And third, to help advance and promote the case for high standards of integrity and responsibility in our business institutions and their leadership. So to help us develop this dialogue and pursue these goals, we have three outstanding business leaders who have joined us from three very different industries and backgrounds, promising a really diverse and interesting conversation. Now you can help us in this task as well by participating in tonight's discussion yourself. We'll have several opportunities during the evening to take questions from the audience. So please don't be shy. We need this to be at least a two-way conversation. We also have a very skilled and articulate moderator to keep the discussion on point and well-balanced. Professor BUIE Sewell is no stranger to many of you. He has been a well-respected teacher on the Daniels faculty for many years and is consistently cited as the most popular professor, as one of the most popular professors on the Daniels faculty, with special praise from his executive and professional MBA classes on his course, The 21st Century Professional. BUIE has enjoyed a varied career, having served as a Presbyterian minister early in his career, as a practicing lawyer, as a political advisor, candidate, and operative, an executive with a number of nonprofit organizations, and finally as a professor of business and ethics here at the Daniels College of Business. BUIE is also a member of the American Board of Medical Specialties Ethics Committee. Professor Sewell holds an MS in theology from Union College, a Juris Doctor from the University of Denver Sturm Law School, and has completed additional postgraduate studies at the New College, University of Edinburgh. Please welcome BUIE Sewell. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. And something should be said at the outset about the work that Dan Sweeney and Ashley Mercer have done to provide this amazing evening that we're having. Thanks to both of you, Dan. We wouldn't be here without that. This is going to be a special evening because we have extraordinarily unique, special guests. The Dean mentioned what an amazing panel this is, and I'm going to take a moment to embarrass them, but to make their mothers, wherever they may be, enormously pleased, and let you know the kind of folks that we have here. Going from my left, your right, Douglas Conant is founder and CEO of Conant Leadership, a mission-driven community of leaders and learners who are championing corporate leadership that works for the 21st century. Doug is also a New York Times best-selling author and keynote speaker. He is co-author of Touch Points, Creating Powerful Leadership Connections in the Smallest of Moments. From 2001 to 2011, Doug served as CEO and president of Campbell Soup Company, and prior to joining Campbell, he was president of Nabisco. He is presently chairman of the Kellogg Executive Leadership Institute at Northwestern University. His MBA is, of course, from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. He lives presently in Chicago, but has family in Denver. Barbara MOWRY is founder and CEO of GORE Creek Advisors, a management consulting firm focused on working with CEOs and boards of directors on business strategy and innovation. Barbara has served as Senior VP of the Data Integration Division of Oracle Corporation, and prior to coming to Oracle, she was President and CEO of Silver Creek Systems, with which Oracle acquired. Barb has been a senior executive in 3 Fortune 500 companies, including Requisite Technology, Comcast, and United Airlines, as well as CEO of 4 entrepreneurial ventures. She also serves as the chairman. She also has served as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City. Barbara has a bachelor's degree from Miami University of Ohio, an MBA from the University of Minnesota, where she is a member of the executive committee of the Board of Overseers of that great university. Mark SOANE is director of Gilpath Partners and Appian Ventures, which I think, Mark, you were one of the founders of. He currently represents Appian on the board of directors of several of the firm's portfolio companies. Earlier in his career, Mark served as senior operating positions with Multum Information Services, Trade, and Personix Corporation. Mark is the former chairman of the Rocky Mountain Venture Capital Association. He was appointed by the Colorado State Senate to serve on the Colorado Venture Capital Authority, where he is presently chairman-elect. Mark also serves as treasurer of the Colorado chapter of the National Association of Corporate Directors. He is former chairman of the Colorado 14ers Initiative, where he remains a board member. Mark is a graduate of Dartmouth College with an undergraduate degree in history and holds an MBA from Stanford Business School. Let's welcome again our panel. It's been a while since I've been asked to do this kind of thing. I think it was the wisdom of the college not to have me do such. I was invited once to be on a panel that had a very prominent speaker who actually, I hope is not present tonight, but if he is, he made a very good speech. It was just that the title of his speech was, "Do Corporations Have a Soul?" And I was asked to moderate the panel. Now, I have a degree in theology and have studied something about souls, and I've been teaching business ethics and corporate responsibility for going on 22 years, long enough to become iconic. I'm just overwhelmed. I knew I would end up something, but an icon was not actually in my plans. Anyway, I don't believe corporations have a soul. And I wanted to say that as gently as I could in the very distinguished setting a few years ago, but I think I did not succeed too well. I got into Joyce Kilmer's poem Trees about what only God can make, and reference that in terms of only God can make souls, and the corporations were clearly not made by God, they were made by human beings, and that they had cultures, not souls. I wasn't invited back for years and years. I will behave better tonight.
I don't know.
We'll
see
Doug,
about
I
that.
promise you I will behave better tonight. The issues before us, it seems to me, are so critical for the time we are now in. How do you lead some of the largest structures of human relationships ever created? How do you lead 30 and 40,000 employee corporations with mega billion dollars of capitalization? And the way we will enter that conversation is with three people who have a lot to tell us about it. I wondered when I came here years ago if there would be content for the way I go about teaching, which is by using cases and dilemmas, and would there be some examples from the business world that we could use in the teaching of ethics? In 22 years, I have never been short of material. The Volkswagen situation that has been going on this past year or so in terms of distorting the performance characteristics of their automobiles, the problems that have been faced by the likes of Fox News, of United Airlines, and of Wells Fargo, one of our dearest banking partners and presence in Colorado, are themselves iconic and least indicative of the kind of difficulties we have in running very, very large institutions and in leading them in ways of responsibility. Doug, what's going on? What's happening in terms?
Good.
I said I would be gentle.
I've never had a chance to sit so close to an icon before, so
Get out
I'm
of
a
here.
little in awe. It's great to be here, and I'd like to also thank Dan. Dan's been trying to get me to come here for 3 years. He's a dog on a bone. I kept saying, I don't live here, I don't live anywhere near here, it's not on the way to anywhere I'm going. But here I am 3 years later.
Thank you.
It is great to be here. And I've been looking forward to this discussion. I'm not an ethicist, but I'm a practitioner. And I have been working my way in the business world since getting my MBA in 1975. I've been started at the entry level, and I've been working my way through companies for going on 40 years now. And I do have points of view on things. And I'm going to shift kind of what my opening comment was going to be based on what you just said. I think Milton Friedman would also agree with you that companies don't have souls. They have cultures. Individuals have souls.
Yes.
And Milton Friedman, who is often blamed for all of the ills that we're facing, because he said the primary responsibility for free enterprise is to make as much money as possible. And he said it. But he also said, in basically the same sentence, that it had to be within conformance of the expectations of society, as embodied in the rule of law, and as embodied in the ethical customs of the culture. And what I've experienced over the 40 years has been, we've been in a place where we've been emphasizing the financial performance side of the ledger, but inadequately emphasizing the ethical responsibilities that come with the opportunity to serve a large organization, to drive for performance. We're not, this is just my personal opinion, we're doing better than we've ever been, but we're not nearly as good as we need to be. It's inadequate. And time and again, we see companies losing their way. And we'll cover all kinds of issues today. But we have to find our way to a place that embraces with abundance the notion that you can perform well in the marketplace and you can do so ethically. There's no reason those two things have to be mutually exclusive. And it's not one or the other, it's both. And they have to be coupled at all times. And as we get into it today, I'll talk more about it. But that's my fundamental belief.
Thank you, Doug. Barbara, how do you see things today?
Well, I think it's really interesting. It was mentioned, one of my experiences was an executive in the airline business, which I debated whether I should even mention tonight based on but
We're not going to drag anyone
yeah, right.
out.
But what's really interesting is, you know, when you get on an airplane right now, you don't clap that you landed, or you took off safely or you landed. And that's an expectation. Yeah. You know, you expect it. And I think when you look at some of the pressures that businesses are facing now, you know, the expectations are changing a little bit when you look at things like globalization. You know, all businesses are global businesses now. I don't care if you're doing something in your garage. You know, you can sell into China or China selling through you, or, you know, something is happening globally. Social media, clearly, there's good news and bad news. The good news is, you know, companies are aware of one incident that can destroy their whole brand. And so I hope it's making them think about it more. On the other hand, you can take, you know, one rogue employee or somebody that just had a bad day and suddenly, you know, your whole world has changed. The speed of change is so different now with the internet. Managing to the quarter, the financial pressures. I come out of the tech world, and disruption in industries is causing so much financial pressure, even more than it used to be in a shorter period of time. And the globalization issues are really interesting, I think, because, you know, what used to be, I mean, I spent half my life worrying about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, you know, and what I learned there, when you go into some other countries, some of the things that would be a violation of that act are a form of gratitude, you know, and totally acceptable. And yet you're supposed to do business in those countries. How do you deal with those things? It becomes very difficult. So I think there's a lot of pressures in today's world where takeoff and landing is not expected like it used to, with the relationship that companies have with all kinds of stakeholders, the broadened definition of stakeholders, to Doug's point. I mean, you have, you know, your communities are stakeholders, clearly your shareholders are stakeholders, your employees, your suppliers. You know, I mean, there's a whole set of infrastructure that comes with running a business now that is heightened in terms of the dependencies and the speed at which you have to make decisions.
Yeah. So, Mark?
I don't think anybody comes to an event like this to hear that nothing has changed. So I'd talk about just in my business career, I'd say there are a number of things that have changed around the discussion of business ethics, starting with the fact that we discuss them. I left college and went into about a 9-month, fairly intensive training program in a large multinational. The word ethics did not come up once. Going to business school, we had a class called Business in the Changing Environment. And no one referred to it as ethics. In fact, I didn't realize I had been in an ethics class until a few years after, and I started thinking about what we were talking about. But it wasn't, people didn't have an and it was part of the core curriculum that you had to get for your MBA. But it was not something that was high in people's awareness. So that's the first thing that I'd say has changed. Doug made a reference to Milton Friedman and that, you know, within that sort of the code, the framework of ethics of a society. And I'd say that framework is moving. And it probably moves across generations all the time. But I think things have been fairly dramatic in the last 50 or 60 years, as we all grew up with 3 TV stations, so we all watched the same TV shows. We all read the same, every city had 2 newspapers. We read the same newspapers. We were 50% more likely to sit in church or in temple with our neighbor listening to the same preacher or rabbi. We went to workplaces that were more male, were more white and more European. So we've introduced how people, the issues that people care about are different. So, not to say that things were less ethical 40 or 50 years ago, but I think there was more common experience, and you sort of understood how to behave. As companies get bigger, they get less personal. I think the issues get much more difficult, and finding the common ground, finding the issues that you are going to be concerned about is an active affair. It doesn't happen passively. And then I'd add that the final thing that's changed is Facebook, Twitter, chat rooms, websites that list all of your charitable and political contributions. There simply is a much more ill-defined line between your private and your public life. Yeah. So if you or your company are going to espouse a code of ethics, you really have to live up to it. And I think Travis Kalanick is learning how Uber really does treat its drivers. United Airlines certainly can't go and say that they put their passengers first. I would say those are the things that I have noticed.
Thank you. We'll start off maybe somewhat negative, but that means we can end up more positive. Doug, when things go wrong in a large corporation, what are some of the reasons for that? What in your experience got fouled up?
In 25 words or less?
No, you can do many more.
I can elaborate a little more. I'll use my company as an example. When I was CEO of Campbell Soup Company, small Fortune 300 company, $10 billion in sales, 20,000 employees. We had operations in 38 countries. We had marketing products in 120 countries. And on average, when I did my touch points work for my book, I discovered there were at least 2 million interactions a day going on inside of my company. There were 100 per person interacting with each other or with suppliers or regulators or customers. 2 million a day. And the complexity at managing all that was beyond our capacity at the time. And we were a small company. I've spoken at Wells Fargo's Consumer Lending Group, and they're even bigger, and they have even more stuff flying around. They were getting in consumer lending about 400 emails a day, 40 to 60 text messages. And then they had their own priority email system on top of that, so they knew what they really had to read. And this was every day, and if you missed a day, you had 800 the next day. And so the ability to get your arms around all of the things that are going on is beyond capacity. Additionally, you have you have much more complexity. You have 6 different generations in the workplace now. Half of them are women, which is a profound change, very positive, not positive enough yet. You've got ethnicity abounds, globalization abounds, so you have you're managing so much complexity. The challenge is, in these companies, to establish a code, I'm going to use the word code of conduct, that is just unmistakable in the company and brought to life every day in the way they do their business, just like they have to bring to life every day their financial reporting. We have to take a much more structured approach to establishing what our ethical stance is on how we will do business. These companies everybody understood how the game was played, but they didn't understand the ethics of the expectations of their customers. And that's unacceptable. And so I think where they lost their way was they were trying to manage all this complexity And I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. In my experience, 95 out of 100 people are just trying to do the right thing. But they lost their way in a sea of complexity in changing times, and then they didn't acknowledge it. The most troubling thing to me with the Volkswagen example that you and I talked about, your wife experiencing it, my cousin experiencing it, the Wells Fargo thing that, you know, I don't know how far it went back. It went down at least to 2007, 8. Inexcusable that they couldn't acknowledge the shortcoming.
And there are antecedent events to that. When I first started teaching here, you know, Sears had an auto repair division, and they put real incentives on selling more air filters and tires and changing oil and that kind of thing. And even if you didn't need a new fan belt or an oil filter, the people on the delivery line were under pressure to perform.
Yeah, they were.
And they did it.
And they do it, and it's a sea of complexity, and we haven't established clear enough standards and held people accountable to them within our companies. I will tell you, and I'm sure they've had the experience too, Barbara and Mark. I've been in large enterprises that are well controlled and that are highly principled. It can be done, but it has to be done overtly and unmistakably. And in the companies where it's not clear, it's an issue, and it was not clear in any of these companies. And to the point where the CEO of Volkswagen was holding on to his position because he didn't want, he didn't feel culpable. Yeah. It's unimaginable.
Yeah. Barb, has it just gotten too complex for human beings to manage?
Well, I think for all the reasons that we talked about before. I mean, there is a, you know, when we were in the banking crisis, you know, and all the, you know, the too big to fail issue came out. Another way to look at it is too complex to manage, is because a lot of the whole supply chain of this whole thing and looking at how it was regulated and all of that, there were big pockets of things that just were missed. But I think it's really interesting when you look at, you know, what can managements do about this? You know, why did this thing happen? The culture, to Doug's point, it starts with the culture, and it starts with tone at the top, and it starts with, you know, just because something's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. Absolutely. And it's just because you say you do something, it's what you actually do that matters more than what you say you do. And because you will never be able to create a culture where 100% of the time you're going to prevent something from happening. Something will happen just because people are people and they make mistakes, and to your point, most people try to do the right thing, but occasionally they don't. And so how you react to it is as important. I mean, it's Tylenol versus Volkswagen, right? I mean, you know, classic Tylenol example. So I think the keys to doing it is to create the culture and the tone at the top. And what does that mean? I mean, everybody talks about that, but it means transparency. It means having lots of ways for communication to occur, either through a chain of command or outside. Can employees, if they don't feel comfortable talking to their supervisor about something and they see something that is wrong, how do you provide avenues for them to get that information? It's also metrics, you know, to the complexity. What are the metrics that you are focused on as a management team to make sure that if something's starting to go south or you don't understand things, like that one division of Wells Fargo, I would imagine, they talked about getting rid of 5,000 people over a fairly short, well, somebody ought to, you know, somebody was looking at employee turnover and trying to see what, should have been seeing what was happening there. So I think the kinds of metrics that you have are important, the transparency and the number of avenues and ways that people and customers can communicate. And then you have to look at your reward systems, because there are always unintended consequences. For reward systems, I mean, to your muffler example, you get what you pay for. If you want more mufflers, you're going to get them. You know, if you want more accounts, you're going to get them. But how are you getting them? Right. And all of us have dealt with, you know, unintended consequences for all kinds of things. So I don't think there's a silver bullet for any of these things, but you really have to understand. And by the way, having been in a, you know, when I was at Oracle, I mean, I had teams that I was managing in 20 countries. And so, you know, somebody was always up in the middle of the night talking on the phone, or something was happening, and boy, the cultures and the laws in those countries are all so different, and the complexity is so different, and the time frames are so short to make decisions. That's where metrics, culture, it's, you know, in the airline business, you know, you have an absentee workforce a lot of the time. No supervisors on the plane. If something happens, when you're in 36,000 feet in the air, the culture is what's going to take over. It's when you see a flight attendant that is drinking and you're another flight attendant, what takes over is who you are as a person and what you are going to tolerate in the culture and what you're going to do about it, because it's possible no one would ever know. So what do you do? And those things are very culturally oriented in companies and really important.
Doug, I like the way Mark talked about, and Barb underlined, the complexity of things, but up against the simplicity of having a code, having principles that everyone understood this is who we are. That against 2 million transactions a day, there are also some very straightforward standards that are, you know, not 2 million of them,
No.
but a few of them. Do you see things that way?
Well, I'll say my perspective is in much smaller, my experience, much smaller organizations than Doug and Barbara have worked in. So most of my dealing with the issue would be in boardrooms and dealing with management teams. And in both the Volkswagen and the Wells Fargo cases, there had to be a certain lack of skepticism. Somebody was not following up on a question. Any investor-owned company is going to be setting, you'll start with financial goals, and those financial goals will explode down into a lot of other objectives that will then filter through the organization. Unfortunately, I spend a lot of time in my companies talking about why goals are missed on the downside, but everybody perks up when a goal is somebody beats a goal and wants to understand why. And I think there needs a culture of understanding where how the metrics are being achieved or not being achieved. I think would have made a big difference in both of those companies. Mm-hmm. And how could you see an increase in the number of new accounts and not have interrogated somebody as to how they were getting there, just taking it for granted and assuming that it was as it had been in the past? I would want to know so I could double down on that effort.
And by asking.
Only by it's a skepticism and a curiosity that, and a conscientiousness that you have to bring to your job.
Yeah. I talk a lot in my classes about the importance of seeing relationships as the source of value. Especially in Wells Fargo, and I'm a customer of Wells Fargo, it seems to me something must have broken down in terms of the relationship between people. That, no one asked, no one paid attention, no one followed up. Doug?
First of all, you don't need a long list to sort of declare your expectations of your culture. I think you got a great list right here. Mm-hmm. The Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative and the 8 principles here is all you need. You just got to bring them to life in your company in an everyday way. So the answer is, Mr. Icon, there's a great foundation right here.
Yeah. And those principles came from a man, Bill Daniels, who was someone engaged with people, was someone whose life really changed and moved the people who were around him. There was a human dimension. Yeah. And that seems to me to be the byplay that we need, is principles plus relationship.
And the relationship stuff is hard in large organizations. Somebody says the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And that's the soft underbelly of this conversation, because the relationships aren't as robust as they need to be. The management candor is insufficient, I believe, as a byproduct of that. The trust levels are not well enough developed because there's an absence of competence and character in that relationship that's fully expressed. And so that is the soft underbelly. The relationships where you have candor and you have trust in that room and you can talk about issues of performance and of substance, these things are so obvious, you know, and they're also so obvious in hindsight as we read all the reports afterwards. The only thing I could say, and I don't know a hill of beans about the Wells Fargo, the actual experience, but that number it probably wouldn't have even been discussed in a boardroom, given you've got 5 board meetings a year, day and a half each, and you have so many metrics across so much geography. I don't know this, but I would guess it wouldn't even have risen to a place where it would be discussed at a board level. In the management ranks, something's rotten in Denmark. But you know, I think you're right. Relationships are an issue, but I think companies aren't stepping up and declaring what they want to stand for, like he did, and then walking the talk every day, you know, with transparency. It sets you free. You declare yourself, you walk the talk, and it sets you free from all this, and you hold people accountable, and if they cross the line, there's a logical consequence to that behavior. We can find our way through this, but these large companies have to step up and have to be more aggressive on the way they articulate their stand on things and the way they manage it and follow through on it.
Yeah. Barb, you have done maybe 3 entrepreneurial startup sorts of activities, and you've worked for very large corporations. I know corporate leaders think and talk about this, but how do we combine the vibrancy of a startup, the newness, the freshness, the engagement, with a large corporation that has to be structured and organized and in some ways pretty vertical in terms of relationships? Isn't that spirit of the startup something that has actually ethical connotation?
Well, it does, because you hold each other accountable and responsible for things. When you know somebody, you know, if you want to have your friend come and work for your company because you enjoy working with your friend, you don't want to put your friend in a lousy place to work.
Yeah.
You only want to have
Because it's your friend.
It's your friend, and you want to work with great people, because great people make other great people. So I think there's a couple of things that I've noticed that you can do very successfully and it works no matter what size company you're in. And it really speaks to this culture issue. So first of all, to help who do you hire? You know, it starts with the hiring process. You know, there is a culture that you want to establish in the company. There are the kinds of people. I used to think about employee performance on kind of a matrix where you have those people that are getting great performance or not, and then those people that are great cultural fits with the organization or not. And the hard ones are the people that are getting great performance who are absolutely not a cultural fit, because they're helping you get your numbers, but that's a very short-term thinking, because they are a cancer to the organization, and they're going to screw up the whole rest of it. And you cannot have those people in your company. So I think it starts with who you hire and helping employees understand what you expect of them, and then walking. It has to do with stories. I mean, in thinking about this, you know, I haven't made the icon stage yet, but you know, before my eyes, I was kind of going through some of the experiences that I've had. I mean, the list was so long, and when you're going into the workforce, in a million years, you never expect any of these things to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, these things don't happen, right? So I just the flight attendant drinking thing happened. I inherited a company that got bought that I found out I was running a major drug ring in a cocaine ring. From this company that I inherited. I was given the opportunity to create, I know something about developing long-term relationships with customers through some programs that I've run, and I had a startup company, and we were given this opportunity to create a customer loyalty program, basically, for a beer company. In essence, it was a frequent beer drinking program, and this was a brand that you would be very familiar with, one of the biggest in the world, and they were going to give us a huge amount of money to do this. And we were just getting started with our company, and I turned it down because all I could see is Mothers Against Drunk Driving taking our card out of the person's wallet after he killed a child because he was drunk, and that's not the way to build a business. It's just the wrong thing to do. Knowing, by the way, that they were going to go somewhere else and have somebody else would do it. I'm sure they could find, it wasn't that it wasn't going to happen, but we weren't going to do it. And I told that to my employees, and I told them why. First of all, they looked at me like I was crazy when I told them how much money was involved. But it made a huge point. So these stories that you do in the company, I found a strategic plan for my major competitor sitting in a boarding gate of an airplane getting ready to, it was just, they had left it there. It was a notebook, the entire strategic plan of one of my major competitors.
Wow.
Oh, man, did I want to open that, but I didn't.
Yeah.
Because somebody would have, people find out about stuff like that, and what example is it? So, there are just things that happen, and it comes back to culture, the kind of people that you hire, the stories that you have, the values that you lay out, but actually showing employees how you live those things is really an important.
Mark, this may not be fair, and just do something else if you want to. But one of the subjects I hope we would turn to before we bring our amazing audience into this is the issue of compensation. We've sort of touched the edges of that, but the incentivizing of priorities, the disparity between not tone at the top, but pay at the top and pay at the bottom. It's probably never been greater than it is today. And it's become a political issue. You take oversight for your funds of several corporations. How does pay figure into the responsibility and the ethical nature of a company?
So when we go on a board, we often participate in the compensation committee. So we're specifically addressing, spend most of the time with the top 3 or 4 members of management and their incentive plans. I don't think you see in terms of salary, big, the eye-popping numbers that you would see with public companies. You tend to fight more over perhaps bonuses, and you fight a lot over equity. And at the end of the day, it's a bit more meritocratic, I think, in a small company, because you are more likely to change a CEO if a CEO does not perform. And if you make yourself very expensive, you make yourself in some ways a more attractive target. The other thing that I think CEOs in venture-backed companies, and I won't say that this is universal, but some are aware that a large pay package for them will ripple down through the company and raise the overall payroll, which means in startup terms, shorter life. Because if you're living from one financing to the next, there is some pressure there. Now, having said that, I'd say the most unpleasant periods that I have had in terms of overseeing our portfolio companies have been with CEOs on compensation committees, where it is, you see, let's say you see the darker side of people. And ironically, despite the fact that from a personal, perhaps from an ethical perspective, some of those people are diminished in my eyes, there's a very high correlation between the greediest CEOs and the ones who ended up making the most money for their companies and for the employees. So there is I do think you end up in private companies a little better alignment in terms of success, unlike you can have with the guy whose name always came to mind, because I remember for years he led the tables of the most overcompensated CEO in the country. Was Ray Irani of Occidental Petroleum, had the worst performing stock relative to his pay for 10 years and never was replaced. You don't tend to have as much of that situation.
I just talk a little bit about CEO compensation. And I chaired a comp committee for Applebee's restaurants and went through explosive growth and had experienced that. As CEO of Campbell Soup Company, I dealt with the comp committee a lot on that, and then as chairman of Avon Products, I've dealt with a lot of that.
I meant to say that in your introduction.
But no, that's all right. But you know, we're talking about very large companies. There are, you know how many CEOs there are in the United States? Nobody does. Do anybody in here? 25 to 30 million CEOs in the United States. We're talking about the Fortune 500, all right? We've got another 29 and a half, we got a lot more to go. And you know what the average comp is for those CEOs?
Beyond the Fortune 500.
No, just the whole group, 25 to 30 million, $180,000. Doctors make more than the average CEO. The average CEO makes a little more than his neighborhood dentist. He makes, or she, he and she, they make 3.5 times the average salary of the average worker. The whole system is not cockamamie here. You know, I would say that's a pretty, you know, in broad terms, that's credible, given the responsibilities the CEO has to shepherd an organization through the kind of VUCA world we're talking about, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So in the larger context of everyday CEOs, I think we're making a mountain out of a molehill. In the Fortune 500, or I could say the Fortune 1000, and we could pick a lot of private equity plays, it's different. It's a different game. And even there, it's not salary. Salary is set, it's high, but it's set. It's not where all the money's made. And it's only growing with the average growth rate of the other salaries in the organization.
But it's options and equity.
Yeah, when you get to equity and bonuses, that's an issue.
Yeah.
And that has to be addressed by the large companies. And by the way, the large companies are managing these large complex things we were talking about. And if you're on a board, you want somebody that's got the capacity to do that. And because if they don't do it well, you have issues too. So you're looking for the best available athlete to do that. And you're willing to pay a good base salary for that. Where we lose our way is on our bonuses and our equity. We have to revisit that. And we have to revisit it in the largest companies through the large exchanges. You know, there are so many wonderful stories about wonderful CEOs, I think he's probably one of them, who are doing just great things in this country. But we have lost our way in this segment, and it's got to get addressed.
And Doug, how do you see that being addressed? How do you see that taking place?
Well, well, I'll tell you one way I see it. Any one of us, the companies I've been associated with, we have the capacity to address those things.
I think there's an interesting issue.
Yeah.
That is particularly comes to light at times like this when we have a robust stock market. Because all those equity awards are tied to the stock market price. So
And
when
when
the
the
stock market
market
goes wildly up,
collapsed, yeah.
you know, the CEO, which by the way, one could argue how much they have to do with their stock market price at a time like this.
BUIE.
I mean, they can-
Or on the other
Yeah,
side,
now
or when the market
level
collapsed.
3 actually tied its option awards to how level 3's shares had done against a bunch of proxy companies, to take that out of it.
to take it out. I mean, I think
Yeah.
there is an argument to be made, and by the way, ISS and of course all these proxy firms that are advising, you know, boards to look at TSR as their, you know, the main metric for that, and that is fraught with all kinds of issues, I think. You know, what can a CEO control? They certainly have a lot of control over the growth of the company and how they grow it. Margins, they can control, you know, in terms of just financial performance. They have a lot of things that they can control. Market share, those things. The stock market, I would argue they can't control. But yet, you know, the most recent example, Larissa, you know, Yahoo CEO, is, you know, coming away with a humongous pay package
For failing. $187 million.
Now, one can argue, nobody would take the job, and so they had to pay, you know, kind of thing, you know, and it worked out so that shareholders are getting something. But, yeah, I think there's a lot of, I think we really do need to think through the basis of how we pay CEOs for these kinds of companies. I agree with you, the majority of them are not out of whack.
But the
where's-
ones we hear about.
Well, and we hear about the ones.
Yeah.
Well, there's we've started to use in some of our companies restricted stock grants to try to, and there's a psychological value to thinking that you already have something, as opposed to, you know, I got to swing for the fences, and if I get it over the fence, I'm going to make a ton of money, and if I fail, I'll just get my options, replenished, and at a lower strike price, and go at it again. Now, restricted stock grants have they're not as tax efficient, but you do get better alignment, I think, with the investors.
Options are drifting away. Maybe
Yep.
not in private equity.
Yeah, it's just starting
Not
to
in the venture
happen
world, but
in our world.
Everybody in the public world is migrating to restricted stock.
Yep.
I've got many, many questions, but I've had too much opportunity with these great people. We have 2 microphones. Anyone want to ask questions of our panelists? And a question mark comes at the end of a question. Okay, thank you.
You've done this before.
Yeah.
Hello, BUIE. Hello, Barb. So the overarching question for me is intent. Our public has not trusted our government for decades. They no longer trust the media. Academia is under duress because our middle class is $1.4 trillion in debt for degrees that don't generate jobs. Is our entire culture unethical? And when it comes to business, I ask you, how many people on the panel have gone to work for 30 or 40 years where you really believe, are your peers doing this on purpose? Is the intent, do they do it deliberately, or is it an accident? The Talleyrand thing, a crime or a blunder? And with the new behavioral science research, Katherine Heffernan, willful blindness, and Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, a Nobel Prize. Human beings are remarkably self-deceptive, and they forget everything. Isn't it the complexity? How could we be where we're at if business was always deliberately unethical? Are we making a mountain out of a molehill here? Where would you be if you were all unethical? So, there you go.
Where would we be? Probably right in this hall talking about it. No.
I mean, I don't agree with the premise that businesses are, you know, always unethical. My experience, I can only speak from, you know, but I've been in many different industries, big, small, regulated, non-regulated, all kinds of things. I honestly can tell you that I have never met a person that actually tried to do the wrong thing to make something extraordinary happen. What I have seen, and we've already talked about this, is people that got put, it's the classic good people in bad situations, bad things can happen. And so the pressures were there. Maybe there was a family issue, personal issue that they were, things were collapsing around them, and they made a really bad choice. And what you can't necessarily stop those things when you're in a company from happening, because it can be an individual it can affect. But what you can do is how you react to it, and make a statement in the business about how you react to it. And I think those are the things. So Chris, I don't agree with the premise. It's certainly not been my experience that people go to work and say, how can I screw something up and make a bunch of money for me and for everybody else? I really have just never been in that situation.
I agree with Barb, and I think she's agreeing with you, if I understood where you ended up.
Yep.
My personal experience is very much aligned with that. I've worked in a variety of companies that had some really difficult situations that we faced, but they tended to be ones that were created by what a friend of mine circle of doom. There would be some kind of overpromise and underdelivery, and then there's something happened, and they would overpromise and underdeliver, and somehow it got into a situation where good people made bad choices. And I agree with you that we have to react swift. It has to be clear what's expected. And Chris, that's what I would say. I don't think it's clear enough. People intuitively know. Look, I have a family of 5, and 3 kids in 3 different cities. I can't keep track of 5 people well. And I don't know what kind of ethical, and they're great people, especially my wife.
This is recorded, so.
But, we're talking 5 people who I know intimately, but they're in strange situations all the time. And who knows what could happen? And that's just my family of 5. When we're dealing with large organizations, it's an imponderable. But I would agree completely that, in my experience, there are good intentions. And because that's the preponderance in my experience, it's real obvious if somebody has ill intent. It sticks out like a sore thumb. You were talking about that person who's so bent on high performance that they're not interested in plugging into the culture. Everywhere I've been, that's so obvious, and they don't last long. They don't last long.
I would say in a large company, IBM or the old Ma Bell, if you went to a company, you went to work for them, you're really relying on sort of the managerial ethics. In startups, you're relying on the integrity of the CEO, and when it's down to personal ethics and actually working and seeing with people, I just don't think it works not to have a code of ethics. From a purely pragmatic point of view, and if you think about it, Facebook was only a startup 10 years ago. So clearly there was something instilled there, the movie aside in terms of maybe how Zuckerberg was portrayed. But there had to be something that people trusted him enough both to stay there, but also to perform dramatically well.
Another question for the panel.
Boy, you're just so overwhelmed by this conversation.
This has been fascinating, so thank you. And indulge me for a minute. I haven't run a Fortune 500 company, but I've been curious that no one has mentioned putting the customer first. And is that too simplistic a thought relative to building that into a culture? I mean, I look at United Airlines. If customers came first, people wouldn't be dragged down the hallway. At Wells Fargo, if the customer came first, we wouldn't be putting credit cards in the hands of people that didn't want them. If customers came first at VW, customers wanted an environmentally sensitive car that had great performance. They didn't want to be deceived by a bunch of engineers. So, again, is that concept simplistic? I've been in service businesses all my life, so I've had to deal with thousands of employees that we tried to keep them focused on one thing, and that was making sure the guest had an outstanding experience and they got good value for the money. And we measured that performance to see what our guests or customers were saying about our company.
That's a great point, and I've worked in the consumer products sector virtually my whole life. We always talk about meeting our consumers' needs faster, better, and more completely than anyone else on the planet. We were always focusing on taking care of our consumers first. We had customers, we had the King Soopers of the world who would buy our products and then sell them to the consumer. We were focused on meeting the needs of the consumer faster, better, more completely than anyone else. And if you were taking care of the consumers, the rest of your value chain fell in line. So I think you make a great point. But it's when you get back farther in the value chain and you get past the sales organization and you get into the manufacturing organization or some of the, when you get deeper into the value chain, we would lose sight of the consumer often. They were so caught up in doing what they needed to do to play their role in the value chain. They lost sight of that. And we had to keep that front and center. But that's a great point. If you have that can be your plumb line, right? All the way to the heart of to the soul of the corporation.
But it's interesting. Sorry, I was given this because apparently my mic I broke my mic already. But I think there's conflicting things. You can say you want to put the customer first, and I don't think there's an organization out there that wouldn't want to put their customer first because they want to sell more, and that's how you succeed, by having customers stay with you. But you get into these conflicting situations, and I think the pharma industry is a really interesting example of that. If you look at the pharma industry, we have a healthcare system that incents research and development for new drugs by giving patents so that you can make some money off all of that billions of dollars that you're spending on something, and then something goes off patent. Well, we've seen complete abuse, in the pharma industry. So on the one hand, we want to incent pharma companies to do R&D to help solve the world's problems and make our healthcare better. On the other hand, they're under enormous pressure to make money by their shareholders, so they have shareholders that they have to satisfy. And then you have customers that, of course, want drugs as cheaply as possible. So, if you listen to give the customer what they want, you'll give them inexpensive drugs, except that doesn't help you have enough money for the R&D. I mean, this is a tough, so you have to look at how this whole thing is lined up. I would argue, I'm on the board of a healthcare company right now, and I would argue that the whole system is hosed up, and we've got to redo, as we've talked for years, whether it'll ever happen, we'll see. But I think it's a really difficult thing to figure out how to put the customer first sometimes, as dumb as that may sound.
I agree with you, and my friends at Harvard always talk about systems. And all this is going on in a large and complex system with stakeholders coming from a variety of angles.
Moving fast.
And moving fast. So it is a system issue. But I would say if you were looking for a place to start, I would start, the customer is not a bad place to start. If I wasn't starting with the customer, I would be starting with the employee. I have a core belief that if you're going to win with your customers, win in the marketplace, you've got to first win in the workplace with your employees. And I would bet you were probably as focused on your employees as you were those customers. You knew if I had employees that were well-grounded in what we stood for and how we were trying to move forward, that they would represent you properly with those customers. But it's not a bad place to start, but it is a complicated world, yeah.
Mark, did you want a piece of that?
Yeah, I don't know that putting the customer first is enough. My experience is mostly with enterprise software companies. And if you don't take care of the customer the first time you put out a new application, you're going to go out of business. So that's a requirement of being in business. And in the meantime, I think you could still be abusive, and I've seen some of this. You could burn your employees out. You don't necessarily have to treat them well to make that happen. It may not be the best long-term solution for the profitability of the business, but I do, and so I agree. I think it's necessary, but I think there's more to being successful, and that's what you're doing inside.
Barb, you mentioned the pharmaceutical industry. Maybe I've returned to this too often, but it triggers an issue I raised in the classroom. CVS Pharmacy, Larry Mello, CEO, perhaps the highest paid or compensated, better way to put it, executive in the world, $250 million in 1 year. With the crisis we're having in healthcare and its cost, including drugs, how do we level that? How do we make sense of that? How does a pharmaceutical business, in terms of the needs of its customers, which are life and death needs, make sense of an executive pay package that's 403 times greater than the average employee at CVS?
It's not a pharma, it's a drug company. I mean, it's a drugstore, right?
Yes.
Okay, they have.
But they sell.
They're a distributor of pharmaceutical products.
Okay.
But I can't make sense of the compensation, and I'll come back to there are wild, unacceptable exceptions that we have to create guardrails around that, so that theoretically the CEO can not grow profoundly more than the enterprise grows at any point in time. But
I should say CVS has been extraordinarily successful.
Well,
I mean, their share price is
Well,
doing good.
and you want to tie, the key is to tie performance, compensation to performance. But how do you do it? And it gets back to sometimes the role of the stock market and the things that you don't control. I would not be proud if I was on that board necessarily that my CEO was the highest paid person on the planet. I mean, you have to wonder, the question is always,
can't happen.
is that what we have to pay to get this performance?
Can't
I
happen.
mean, it just,
Can't
it doesn't make sense. So we clearly have some things out of whack. But, the pressures, I was thinking of an example. I didn't have this experience, but you would relate to this. There's this thing called slack fill in products that you're selling.
Yeah.
And so there's a classic example. I don't know if you remember this. It was in the Wall Street Journal. McCormick's, the spice company that, fills the spice rack with all this. So I'm sure some product manager was under enormous pressure, and McCormick's took their black pepper, and it's sold in 4-ounce cans. Well, they took the exact same can, and they filled it with 3 ounces instead of 4 ounces, and left the price the same. Who's going to notice? Do I go look at the, see if the thing, who's going to notice? Well, a lot of people noticed, and including their competitors. They made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Now why did something like that happen? Well, I don't know the details of why it happened, but one would argue that if you really are the CEO of a company that's running the business for the long term, things like that matter, and you do not allow anything. Short-term quarterly profits are not, you can't have such pressure in your organization where you help employees understand that, we would like to be here 100 years from now. And doing things like that is going to make sure that we're out of business next week if we do things like that.
And McCormick's been the best performing food company in the S&P Food Group for 30 years. And
now they have 6 lawsuits and God knows how many more there.
And they're owned primarily by a foundation, which is very well intended. And it just goes to show you how unique situations can affect a company that is widely regarded in my industry as being a very upright citizen. And so you have to be incredibly vigilant. That story, I can't believe it, because that's my business, and it would be impossible for that to happen in my company and me not to know. And we're a lot bigger than McCormick is. I'm aware of the story, and it's like hard to believe. So, the CEO has to own that stuff. I mean, you have to own it. You have to be completely accountable. At Campbell, and by the way, you don't have to be a small company to have a spring in the step in your culture and to be ethical and to perform too. We had the lowest employee engagement in Campbell in the Fortune 500, as measured by Gallup. And when Gallup told us that, I said, well, you've only done a few companies. They said, we've done over 300.
And you were head of the company.
I had just gotten there, and I'm thinking, oh, what did I get myself into? And over a decade, we went from the lowest engagement culture to the highest employee engagement culture in the Fortune 500. And we were spread across the geography I talked about, but we had standards that were unmistakable. We had a code of conduct that was unmistakable. I met with all of my top leaders, with my CFO and my general counsel every quarter, and they had to certify that we were playing by the rules with our code of conduct. Every quarter, eyeball to eyeball. And there were 30 questions we were going to go through, and they were going to answer. And they were expected to do that with their staff too. And it took 8 days a year to get this done. But it was just unmistakable. Companies need to lean into it like that. I just got to believe if McCormick was that clear and was that on top of it 8 days a year, and then whenever there was a violation, someone was held accountable quickly, it gets cleaned up, even in a large company.
You know, the other thing that we really haven't talked about so much, and Mark really brought it up, and that's the role of the board of directors. And the bigger issue there, and this is something that, you know, gets a lot of press now, but diversity of thought in an organization throughout from the board. And what is diversity? We talk about diversity of thought, but people are, you know, we all come with our own experiences. So young people have different experiences than older people, and you know, females have different experience than males, and people from other countries have different experience. You know, all of that. So those are all proxies for diversity of thought. And when you are, I mean, I found it instructive, for example, that Starbucks, you may be aware, several years ago, decided that social media was going to be a key component of their strategy and key to their business. And they looked around the board and they had nobody that they probably wouldn't know Twitter if they ran into it. You know, on their board. So what did they do? They hired a 27-year-old lady who had run several social media companies, was an absolutely expert out of Silicon Valley, very successful at 27, and they put her on the board. Now, you know, so diversity of thought, people ask different questions when they have different experiences, and that is where the power of a company can really come in, when you value diversity and you really make that a force of good in your organization, not a problem.
And you talked about that, being curious, and I talk about candor a lot. If you've got that curiosity going in that boardroom and all these questions are coming from different perspectives, it's hard to believe you're not going to unearth major travesties. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, actually, some of the best board members I've seen bring in the last couple of board packets. And we'll go say, well, you said, you know, you were going to do this the last time or two meetings ago, and you haven't followed up. I mean, you've just got to, you know, you can't let it go. Where I was going in following up on the diversity comment. When we started Appian Ventures, my partners and I, and actually the staff, all did Myers-Briggs and had somebody walk us through, you know, the results of it. And I was somewhat skeptical of going through that process as part of our initial team building.
ISTJ.
I'm actually ENTJ.
ENTJ, I knew the TJ.
But
We just met.
The thing that I got from it was how we arrived at decisions differently. And I would never, instead of being upset that one of my partners was not immediately leaping to this conclusion that I had reached as an N, as somebody who was intuitive, versus somebody who was sensing and an engineer by training, who was more concerned that the process yielded a particular result than what I thought, you know, intuitively I sort of jumped to dessert, and then I worked my way backwards. Right. And it enabled us to work well together and understanding if, you know, I had to meet his requirements, and he, when a deal came to us, I had to, you know, it was reversed. And in my current partnership, I work with a chemical engineer, and I'm a history major. And, you know, just a different way of thinking, and the way that we put, you know, our pattern recognition and what makes us comfortable and feeling like we have a grip around things. But it comes back to, you know, how do you really, getting at diversity of thought is not obvious. I mean, you really, you know, it has to be inculcated in your interviewing process.
I'm tempted, and if given in to temptation, I want to seek your advice about a piece of the course I teach in business ethics. Here at Daniels, we have for 20 years at least taught that business is a profession, not a trade of making money, not a trade of management, but a profession. And one of the things that we identify in talking about that is what Louis Brandeis said over a century ago, which is a profession is a vocation, the single factor for success not being compensation. That is, a doctor, a lawyer, a counselor doesn't look to success in terms of how much they make as the first criteria. We've been teaching that. I was very proud, in a stupid kind of way, that the dean at Harvard asked me and another colleague to come back to the great citadel of business education at the Harvard School of Business. And he wanted to talk to us about how we were teaching professionalism here at Daniels. And he said, you may have noticed when you were coming in, there's a sign over the door that says, making a difference. Harvard Business School, making a difference. He said, we've got some people in prison who made a difference. And we're thinking that perhaps some modifier might need to go with the motto of the Harvard Business School, making a difference for good, making a difference ethically, you know. We talked about that. But the issue of compensation came up even at Harvard over and over again, not just in terms of how business executives are perceived, but the effect that it has on ethical performance. How? See, I wouldn't know. I haven't had gigantic salaries in law and politics and education. But I know what gets me up in the morning, even as I approach 80 years old. And that's the engagement of the work I do. I know that's what gets you guys up in the morning. I've looked at your careers in detail. Where do we get business executives for whom compensation is not the first criteria?
I don't think there. I think you're have a false premise. I don't think that's right.
I'm glad
you're trapped in this. It's compensation, the evil underbelly of all this.
Well, why, if you're selling
well,
drugs,
I'm just going to talk about me. I've made a lot of money.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's nothing wrong with that. And the dean will tell you you could contribute to the Daniels College.
But you know, I talk about leadership as a craft, and it's a mastery model.
Right.
And that we're on sacred ground here. We're dealing with people. We're serving consumers. I get up to do the work, and it's all about the work. And I find if I take care of the work, the compensation takes care of me. It's not about the money. And for the most part, the people I work with have a real healthy, balanced perspective here. I mean, they have to be good family stewards. They have to take care of their families. They want to send their kids to school. They don't want their kids to be deeply in debt when they get out of school. And they want to be able to retire comfortably.
But Doug, did you see how many angry people there were on November 8th in this country?
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with distributional justice. And what I'm probing at, and it was a Japanese executive who said this to me. He asked me about Merillo's compensation, and he said, I'm paid well as a CEO in Japan, but I couldn't lead my people if I took that kind of compensation.
And he couldn't in Japan, and
No.
you really can't here. And 25 to 30 million CEOs, average making $180,000. Okay, we're talking about 200 maybe,
Yeah.
that we got to get our arms around and figure out how to manage this. That is rounding error in the 25 to 30 million we're talking about. It's got to be dealt with, and it's got to be dealt with directly. Okay, I'm not saying.
I understand.
But you know, I'm talking about the 25 million CEOs who are getting up and trying to take care of the work and taking care of their families and serving their communities and putting the customer first and taking care of their employees. I just can't go down this road that says, look at CVS and look at this and say, look at how the world is falling apart. This is Chicken Little talk to me.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
Bowie, if
so-
I can, I'm sorry.
Well, we're just getting warmed up.
I
here.
know, yeah, well, I'm jumping in with you
Save
here,
me,
so
save me from myself. This is on tape.
So, one of the things, these are anecdotes, but again, I've never seen, and I've helped start 4 companies. You've started even more than that. Never once, ever, did I think about doing it because I was going to make a lot of money, nor have I ever met a successful entrepreneur that thought they were doing it because they wanted to make a lot of money. What they thought they were going to do is change the world. That's what they thought they were going to do. And they had an idea and they got excited about it. When my last company was bought by Oracle, you know what my employees were excited about? I mean, Oracle's pretty picky on who they buy and they have lots of options. So it's a pretty big deal in the software business, enterprise software business, to get bought by Oracle. What they were excited about, and they were all going to make money out of this deal, but what they were most excited about was the fact that what they had created was now going to take on a life that was going to go a whole lot broader and a whole lot faster and make a huge impact across the world, because that's where Oracle plays. Not what was, yes, they cared about how much money they were going to make, because that's a scorecard to a certain extent, but they were most excited about what we have created and the fact that all these people saw value in it and we're going to get something out of it. That's my experience, too.
And oh boy.
You-
I'd say,
Jump in.
I think it's more nuanced. I think there are people that are motivated coming out of business school just to make money. And when I was getting out of business school, if you wanted to make money, you went to Wall Street and you worked 85 hours a week as an investment banker. You had no quality of life. You knew you were making that trade, but you were going to get paid well. Probably the same. And I have friends who trade fixed income instruments back and forth all day long. And actually, I have a very close friend, one of the best bridge players in the country as a kid. Fantastic game player. It's a game. It's, that you move back and forth. He likes the game part of it, but not something that, frankly would have appealed to me. I graduated business school. I had no idea how much you made in various professions. So I was drawn to what I thought was fun, which was startups. I think most people are that way, but I think you should have the right to go and pursue. If you're money motivated and that is what makes you, maybe it's insecurity, maybe that's, what, that, you have pressure from the family, then, those avenues are open to you. The wealthiest people in this country are people who took risks. You know, they're the people who did startups. The people who are successful in the world that Barbara and I work with. And those are people who are, you know, far wealthier than anybody in Japan. But along the way, they had lots of opportunities.
So thank you, BUIE, icon that you are. Thank you very much, Doug, for traveling from Chicago to come and join us. And Barbara, it's always a pleasure to have you weighing in on these things. And Mark, thank you very much for bringing your unique perspective to a lot of these issues. Well done, everyone. And thank you here in the audience for joining us this evening, as well as everyone here with us on the internet, wherever you may be. And a special thanks to our volunteer students to help keep things organized. The proceedings of this event will be posted on the Institute's website shortly. The web address is in your program, so don't forget to take that with you. Thank you once again for your participation in this important dialogue and for your investments in the promotion of ethical leadership by being here tonight. Let's try to keep this dialogue going one way or another. You can visit our website and participate in the discussion and exchanges that go along there. Also, please note on the inside of the back cover of your program, there's an announcement there of a new course that's being offered by the Daniels Executive Education Group on May 8th through 10th on the topic of enterprise risk management. One of the hottest topics in boardrooms today, I think you folks would agree with me, and seats are still available. One more item. As many of you know, the Institute is a self-funded operation. In spite of Dean Kreit's otherwise abundant personal and organizational support of our work, we take no money from either the college or the university. We're totally supported by corporate sponsors and individual friends and members. And if you would like to join that outstanding list of sponsors, again, look on the website. The link is in your program, and you'll find a number of ways to contact us and have that kind of conversation. Anyway, thank you very much for your participation this evening and for being with us.